I'm not really sure what to categorize this video, but I just wanted to talk a bit about how I feel like a lot of people give themselves too much exposure to top players and like what the best of the best looks like in terms of performance, and how I feel like that can actually sort of warp expectations of how fast you yourself should be improving. I've always sort of had this belief that when you learn about a new top player for the first time you see their abilities, they're already a really good player. You didn't really witness the sort of growth that they had to go through. So as a hypothetical sort of example, let's say that Emeric was already super popular when he was getting into Osu, and everyone witnessed his first few days and like all the ups and downs of his improvement arc from the very beginning. And then if we were to watch him grow and grow all the way into the number one player that he is now, it would be a lot easier to be like, oh wow, props to Emeric, he really put in all the hard work and he really improved so much since we sort of started watching him. But instead, what usually happens is you hear about a top player for the first time, and your first exposure to their abilities is already them as a top player, if that makes sense. And to some extent, I think that can actually be kind of dangerous when it comes to your own expectations on how you should be improving, especially if you're a relatively new player. So there's this sort of saying, so there's these basically Chinese pancakes, and the story is that you need to eat 6 of them to feel full. But no matter how you eat those pancakes, there's no shortcut to eating the 6th one. Like, you can't eat the 6th one first. You have to eat the 1st through 5th pancake in order to actually reach the 6th one and then eventually feel full. And this saying uses food as a sort of analogy, but this basically applies to any sort of skill-based activity. Really, the anecdote behind that saying is that, pros aren't made overnight, and you sort of have to suffer through a lot of stuff in order to get the reward. And that suffering is usually not seen by the public. And there's another sort of quote that says that exceptional people are built in solitude. I think those concepts sort of go very hand in hand. But going back to that sort of analogy about Chinese pancakes, and if you're curious, more specifically, they're called scallion pancakes, I think. But essentially, I feel like a lot of people fall into this trap where what they're doing is they're watching a lot of top players and they're basically watching them eat the 6th pancake. And so in trying to model after those top players, a lot of people tend to, try to copy that technique or style that the top player is using, and then sort of wonder why they can't perform to the same degree. And then I think that leads to even more frustration over that player's lack of skill, compared to if you were really just comparing your current self to your past self and using top players as a sort of model for what it should look like once you reach that final stage of improvement, but not necessarily what you should be expecting yourself to be able to do just yet. And this sort of concept also applies when it comes to like copying other people's daily routines and things like that, especially those of people that are more successful than you. And this is sort of in a broader sense outside of just Osu. But the point is that you don't want to take someone who's more successful than you or more advanced than you and copy what they're doing now that they've achieved all that success. What you really want to do is look back to see what they were doing when they were in your shoes. And while it still may not be the best routine for you, as obviously everyone is different, it's a much more realistic sort of starting point or routine to model after than a routine of someone who is very, very successful, way past your level, basically. And I do also want to mention that obviously it's important to expose yourself to what top players or more experienced players are doing. So there's this concept called the Bannister effect that basically relates to mental barriers. But even beside that, like when you were a little kid and you were learning your first language, you're just constantly being exposed to proficient speakers of that language, and that gave you a lot of input on what it should look like when you're doing it right. So you can actually check yourself when you're practicing to know if you were making a mistake or if you actually did things the correct way. So there definitely should be some sense of exposure to the correct way of doing things, but really what I'm trying to emphasize is to just be careful not to let those top players or very proficient players sort of warp your expectation on how quickly you should be improving. It can be especially stressful if you only exposed to other top players, and you should feel like, in order to sort of fit in, then you have to be able to somehow jump up to their level of skill. When in reality, especially top players, they understand that there's a progression of skill that people have to go through in order to gradually get better and better until they're eventually at a very, very high level. So yeah, trust me when I say that no one is sort of expecting anyone else to be able to jump up to a really, really high level of proficiency, especially the ones that have already made it up there. there because they know what that process is like to actually improve gradually and take slow steps and be very frustrated, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, hopefully those thoughts help some people out, give some sort of insight to improvement and some sort of mental pitfalls when it comes to observing top players. And yeah, that's about it.